25% of their 6% taken away. I mean, I suppose they were just really happy to be moving into the big time, but so many 60s bands got ripped off. But by the mid-65, that's when it really started to go for the Stones. I mean, Satisfaction, one of their absolute classics. They still perform now, often as our last song. That was the first US number one, and it was the fourth British number one. But they were still the bad boys of rock and roll, still in the middle of 65. They were playing a gig in Berlin, and Mick Jagger decided he'd goose step across the stage and literally caused a riot.
He caused a riot by goose stepping? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, this is Berlin, so in the mid-60s. I mean, the armed forces were still very much in the country.
Oh, boy.
But also 65 was one of my great moments. The Stones were doing one of their package tours with a bunch of other bands, and they reached Chester on the 1st of October, and I was there at the concert.
Pretty awesome, man.
Oh,
I've never got to see the band, and you're talking about seeing the band in their, I won't say infancy, but their early childhood.
Oh, absolutely. It was the Satisfaction tour, and the girls would, as soon as the Stones came on, everybody stood up, and every girl in the theatre, it'd be about 1,000-seater, 1,500 maybe, seater. Essentially, a lot of the gigs at that time were these package tours, and they were in cinemas. And one day a week, they'd have live music, so they'd take the screen away, and the bands would perform. So there were great venues to see a band at. And I remember that as soon as it started, all the girls screamed through the entire 20-minute set. I mean, the earlier bands only played 15-minute sets. You had about 6 different bands on in the same evening. Absolutely incredible.
Hey, you. Yeah, you. Listening there. Don't go anywhere. The John LeBang Show is going to be right back. Just ask the hillbilly.
That's right. Right after this.
What about me? Maybe next time. Pane in the Glass, commercial and residential window cleaning for a beautiful sparkling shine that's crystal clear. Call Pane in the Glass Window Cleaning. You can find them on Facebook at Pane in the Glass.
Hey, man, it's at the bottom of the hour, man. Do you know where your kids are, man?
Now, how long did it take him to move from band to band in between sets? Because today you get about 15 minutes and that's it.
Yeah, it was very quick. I mean, they'd almost always use the same drum kit, and it'd just be a case. And they were very much simpler backlines and setups. And they just moved very quickly from one act to the next, because the whole thing had started about 7 and finished at about 10.
Oh, nice 3 hours of music there.
Oh, it was brilliant. They were good fun. I saw some good bands in those days in that kind of environment. But it's really starting now to become the more mature band when you get to early 66, when they released Aftermath. And that was the first album with all Jagger and Richard compositions. And a bit like the Beatles, the albums being released in the States weren't necessarily the same as the albums being released in the UK. What you tended to have was more albums. Like with Beatles, you had more singles released in America than you did in the UK. But that particular album, Aftermath, was released within a couple of months of itself, either side of around April 66. And it was originally going to be called Could You Walk on Water?
Oh, the album was.
Yeah, when they were recording it, the working title was Could You Walk on Water? But they decided against that, possibly because of the religious connotations, and they settled on Aftermath.
You'll be seeing Mick Jagger doing a goose step on water. Yeah, that'd be great.
Well, exactly. I mean, you've just got so many connotations going on. But interesting enough, within mid-66 now, the Stones did an American tour, finished in Hawaii, and they also did a UK tour. And what nobody realised at the time, that was the last tours with Brian Jones, for reasons that become apparent very quickly. And they hit more censorship problems in '67 on the Ed Sullivan Show. They were promoting their latest song, Let's Spend the Night Together, and the producers, the sensitivities, needed the song to have the lyric change so that Jagger sings, "Let's spend some time together."
Right, they didn't go the way of the Doors. They actually did what they were asked.
That's right. Yeah, the Doors famously a few months later were doing "Light My Fire," and Jim Morrison apparently agreed in the rehearsal and just sang the same lyrics anyway. But what's fun is that a week or so later, that was January the 15th, 67. On January the 22nd, 67, they appeared on the very prestigious UK Sunday Night at the London Palladium TV show. And that particular show, it had been on for years. And it climaxed with the stage itself had a rotating element. And famously, all of the acts and the chorus girls would all get on, and they'd be on this rotating center stage, and everybody would wave to the audience. But I think to try and get some street cred back, the Stones refused to get on the rotating stage and give the traditional wave at the end of that particular show.
And they took some heat for that, probably.
Oh, they did a bit. I mean, the national papers took a fairly dim view of the youth of today, not fitting in with tradition, as it were.
Those rotten kids and that rock and roll music.
Exactly. But why the Brian Jones thing all came about was there were a couple of serious drug busts. Mick and Keith were done in the February of '67. And they were convicted, but it was actually overturned on appeal. But in October '67, Brian Jones actually pleaded guilty to drugs charges, and that then gave them serious problems in terms of touring America, because a drugs bust made it very, very difficult to get the appropriate visas.
How things have changed, Derek. Now you're extra popular if you get busted for drugs.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but that was very much the beginning of the end of the Brian Jones years, basically. I mean, we've still got a couple of years when he's part of the band, but they don't do an awful lot. I mean, interestingly enough, in '67, they released the album Their Satanic Majesty's Request. Again, that was one of the ones on both sides of the Atlantic. And that was their first album to receive very mixed reviews.
Well, just the title's going to turn some people off, especially of the times.
Absolutely. But it was also their attempt at psychedelic music, and it didn't really work out. Though in the UK, the album was released with a great 3D sleeve that, again, is very collectible nowadays.
That's another thing of the times, Derek. Those bands were willing to experiment outside of their normal genre. That's something we don't see these days. These bands are very cookie cutter to their own styles these days. So that was something that gave that era its own defining situation, its own defining moments there.
That's right. And the record companies would actually stay with an artist over a few singles until they became successful, like with the Stones and the Beatles. It took the Beatles 3 singles to get to number 1 in the UK, and it took the Stones several singles before they got to the number 1 spot as well.
And what you're showing me here is they've got some more releases coming up as well. That was another thing. Bands released stuff on a regular basis back then. Which now it's 5-6 years sometimes for an artist to put a new album out.
That's right. Very much, an album would come out more or less every year, and singles until you get to the late 70s when singles were very uncool. People would typically put out 3 or 4 singles a year, every 3 months.
Right, and that's where we're heading in with the release of Jumping Jack Flash.
That's right. I mean, that was important because that was when they changed. Andrew Oldham had produced all of their singles up until that particular point. But this is the first time that Jimmy Miller was brought in, and he produced that particular single. So Andrew Loog Oldham is very much out of the Stones picture at this time now. But 68, the end of 68, I mean, we have talked about this before, so I won't dwell on it. They did their famous TV special, Rock and Roll Circus, that it never went out at the time because Mick Jagger thought that the Who had very much outperformed them. So it didn't actually get seen by anybody until a DVD release in 1996.
Now, that was John Lennon. He was with a bunch of really good artists, and he was doing some other thing in that, right?
That's right. That was his first appearance outside of the Beatles. He called his band Dirty Mac, and that was Keith Richards on bass, Eric Clapton, and Mitch Mitchell from Jimi Hendrix on drums. And Lennon himself referred to himself when he introduced the band as Winston Leg Thigh, which is a great name. Yes. Great name. But it was also Brian Jones's last performance with the Stones, and it's also famous for Tony Iommi, who had a very, very short stay with Jethro Tull, because they were between guitarists. Mick Abrams had left after the first album. This was Jethro Tull, and Martin Barr hadn't quite joined, and he joined for the second album. And in between, Tony Iommi, who was in Earth at the time before they were called Black Sabbath, and David O'List from Nice. He had a short piece with them as well, but I'm not aware of any recordings that they made, because by the time they got to the second album, Martin Barr was the regular guitarist and was for a very long time to come.
I always thought that the one little guitar line in Aqualung had at least a little flavor of Tony Iommi, that down, 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 down.
Yeah, it's a great album.
I have no idea if they borrowed it from him, if he helped write it or whatever, but I always thought that even without knowing that history, that sounded like Tony Iommi.
Yeah, yeah.
And then Brian was sacked shortly after all that, right?
That's right. And the problem was, I mean, this is the sort of summer of '69 now, because they weren't really doing an awful lot. They couldn't get into America. They were moving away from the blues. He wanted to stay more with the blues, and he was sacked on June the 8th. And he wanted to join Lexis Corner, who, of course, he'd started life with, as it were. But Lexis Corner suggested that he should form his own band. But a few days later, July the 3rd, he actually died at his home in the swimming pool. The coroner actually recorded a verdict of misadventure, swimming under the influence of alcohol and drugs. But in 2009, there was a newspaper article in the UK to say, in a national newspaper, to say that the police had actually reopened the case, because there was always a lot of suspicion, conspiracy theories around the way he died.
But it's a tragic progression he went through, pleading guilty of drugs, and then within a few years later, he was sacked. And then he dies.
That's right. Yeah, it's really sad that it should have all ended like that. But that's, of course, then when Mick Taylor came to the fore, and Honky Tonk Woman, actually only released the day after, not deliberately timed like that, but happened to be that it was released on the 4th of July in the UK. And they famously played a free Hyde Park concert in London on the 5th. But interestingly enough, Honky Tonk Women is the last UK number one that the Stones have had, and they fared a bit better in America. Again, Honky Tonk Women was a hit, number one in '69, but then they had number ones with Brown Sugar in '71, Angie in '73, and Miss You in '78. And they're the last hits number ones they've had in America.
Since you're talking since they haven't had one since.
That's right. Yeah, there's not one listed on Billboard since Miss You in '78.
Yet they still sell out shows, and they still are just fat. They're going on tour.
Absolutely, and we will get to that. But that's right. I mean, the Stones are interesting because they haven't had much in the way of